Looking around the world today, you see over 4 billion men walking the earth. Fathers, brothers, sons living ordinary lives, carrying briefcases to work, coaching little league, arguing about politics over dinner. But 7,000 years ago, something erased nearly all of the men who came before them. Women survived, children survived, populations didn't collapse. Only men vanished from the genetic record. Tonight, we unmask the ancient war that erased 90% of men on Earth. A war not fought with bombs, but with inheritance and bloodline loyalty. And the evidence sits inside you right now, written in sequences of DNA passed from father to son for thousands of generations. The greatest genetic collapse in our species' history happened not to our bodies, but to our family trees. This is the story of how it happened, what caused it, and why every human alive today carries the genetic echo of those who survived. Now settle in, grab some tea, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Let's begin. In 2015, Dr. Monica Carmen published findings in the journal Nature that shocked the scientific community. The Y-chromosome, which passes from father to son in an unbroken chain through thousands of generations, showed signs of a bottleneck so severe it defied every conventional explanation. The numbers were staggering. For every 17 women who successfully passed their genes to the present day, only one man did the same. Let that sink in for a moment. 17 to 1. This ratio means that for a period spanning roughly 2,000 years, approximately 80 generations of human life, reproduction became so profoundly unequal that the vast majority of men left no lasting descendants. Their family names vanished from history. Their bloodlines ended in silence. Their genetic contributions were erased as completely as if they had never existed. The implications stunned researchers. This was a global genetic catastrophe affecting the most fundamental aspect of human biology: our ability to pass our genes to future generations. Somewhere in humanity's transition from prehistoric nomads to early civilizations, something went catastrophically wrong for male lineages. But here's what made scientists certain this wasn't a natural disaster. While male ancestry collapsed by 90%, female lineages showed normal, healthy diversity. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and serves as a genetic record of maternal ancestry, continued its usual branching patterns across these same 2 millennia. This asymmetry was the smoking gun. If plague had swept across continents, it would have killed men and women equally. If famine had devastated populations, both sexes would have suffered the same genetic consequences. If climate catastrophe had reduced human numbers, we would see parallel collapses in both male and female lineages. But we don't. The pattern could only mean one thing. Whatever happened specifically targeted male bloodlines while leaving female populations intact. Dr. Melissa Wilson's research at Arizona State University helped clarify what the genetic data was actually telling us. She drew a crucial distinction between census population, the actual number of people alive at any given time, and effective population size, which measures how many individuals successfully pass their genes to future generations. During the bottleneck period, the male effective population size crashed to extraordinary lows, while the census population may have remained stable or even grown. This mathematical relationship pointed to something unprecedented in human evolution: a social catastrophe rather than a demographic one. People weren't dying en masse. They were simply being excluded from reproduction on a massive, systematic scale. The geographic scope was staggering and painted a picture of unprecedented global transformation. Evidence of the bottleneck appeared in Europe, where researchers analyzed DNA from ancient burial sites spanning thousands of years. It appeared in Asia, where genetic studies of modern populations revealed the same dramatic narrowing of male ancestry. It appeared in Africa, the cradle of humanity itself, where our species first evolved. and it appeared in populations that later migrated to the Americas, carrying the genetic signatures of this ancient catastrophe with them to the New World. It was a worldwide phenomenon that reshaped human diversity on every inhabited continent during the same narrow window of time. Whatever process created this bottleneck had somehow become the dominant pattern of human social organization across vast distances and diverse cultures. The timing reveals everything we need to understand about the forces at work. The bottleneck didn't happen randomly throughout human history. It began precisely 7,300 years ago and reached its lowest point 5,000 years ago. Nearly 2 millennia of sustained, unrelenting pressure on male ancestry. Far too long to be explained by a single catastrophic event like war, plague, or natural disaster. Dr. Michael Hammer's research on y-chromosome phylogeny at the University of Arizona revealed the mathematical signature of this collapse with startling precision. Using molecular clock analysis, a technique that measures genetic mutations like a stopwatch counting generations, his team traced the branching patterns of male ancestry backward through time. In a healthy, stable population, you would expect to see steady, consistent branching as populations grew and diversified, each generation adding new branches to the family tree in predictable patterns. Instead, the data showed something that looked nothing like normal population growth. During the bottleneck period, the genetic tree showed dramatic coalescence, where multiple diverse lineages all traced back to just a few common ancestors. It was as if thousands of branches had been systematically pruned away, leaving only a handful of main trunks that then exploded into growth. Think of the family tree of male ancestry as a massive oak with thousands of branches. During the bottleneck, this tree was pruned back to just a few main branches, which then grew explosively to create the canopy we see today. Diversity that took tens of thousands of years to develop was compressed into a handful of surviving lineages in less than 3 millennia. Most men today descend from just a few highly successful patriarchs who lived during or shortly after this bottleneck period. These men weren't necessarily superior in any biological sense. They were simply the winners in whatever process drove this genetic collapse. But how? How do you erase 90% of men without destroying the entire species? The answer lay not in what was destroyed, but in what was transformed. It was caused by fundamental changes in who was allowed to become fathers and pass their lineages forward. To understand this genetic catastrophe, we need to understand what was happening 7,000 years ago. Humanity had recently discovered something that would change everything: agriculture. For hundreds of thousands of years, roughly 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first evolved, our ancestors lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons, following herds of wild game across vast territories. They survived on whatever the landscape provided: fruits, nuts, roots, and occasional successful hunts that fed the entire group. Leadership in these bands was temporary and situational. The best hunter might lead during a hunt. The wisest elder might advise during disputes, but no one commanded permanent authority because there was no permanent basis for that authority. Resources were shared by necessity and custom. When a hunter killed a large animal, the meat was distributed among the group because it would spoil within days anyway. There was no point in hoarding what couldn't be stored. Temporary camps were abandoned when local resources were exhausted, leaving behind nothing of lasting value. This lifestyle created natural checks against the accumulation of permanent power or wealth. No individual could control resources that didn't exist in storable form, and no one could monopolize surplus that would rot before it could become useful. In these egalitarian societies, reproductive opportunities were relatively equal. Yes, more successful hunters might have advantages in attracting mates, but those advantages were limited by the simple fact that no one could accumulate enough resources to support multiple wives or dramatically more children than anyone else. The playing field, while not perfectly level, was far more balanced than anything that would come later. Then, around 12,000 years ago, people in several regions independently discovered something that would change everything. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, communities began cultivating wheat and barley. In China, they domesticated rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, they developed maize. In each region, the transition followed similar patterns and led to similar consequences. This shift from hunting and gathering to farming might seem peaceful, even boring compared to the dramatic conflicts we imagine from ancient times. After all, planting seeds and tending crops sounds like the opposite of violence. But the Neolithic Revolution, as scientists call this transformation, unleashed forces that would reshape not just human society, but human genetics itself in ways that no one could have predicted. When people stopped moving and started staying in one place, they created something that had never existed before in all of human history: permanent property that could be owned, defended, and most critically, inherited by the next generation. Land became valuable in ways our nomadic ancestors could never have imagined. A field that had been cleared of stones and trees, that had been cultivated for years, and whose soil had been enriched through careful management. This wasn't just dirt. This was wealth. Fields that produced grain year after year became assets that could be measured, compared, and most importantly, passed down from father to son. The labor invested in creating productive farmland represented years of work that had literally transformed the landscape. Herds of cattle and sheep became living banks, biological wealth that moved and reproduced itself. Unlike gold or jewels, which were rare and hard to acquire, livestock could be accumulated by anyone with enough land to support them. A successful herder could start with a few animals and, through careful management and favorable conditions, build a herd that represented tremendous wealth. These animals provided milk, meat, hides, and labor. They could be traded, gifted, or inherited. Most importantly, they reproduced themselves, meaning that wealth could grow exponentially without any additional input beyond basic care. For the first time in human history, what you owned determined not just how well you lived in the present, but whether your children and grandchildren would thrive or struggle. The stakes of economic success had become intergenerational, but property created a problem that would prove catastrophic for human genetic diversity, a problem that had never existed in hunter-gatherer societies. If land and animals could be owned, they could also be stolen. If wealth could be inherited, it needed to be protected across generations. And if your family's survival and prosperity depended on defending what you owned from others who wanted to take it, then every neighbor became a potential enemy, and every generation inherited not just wealth but also the ongoing responsibility to defend it. The conflicts that emerged during this period were unlike anything that had come before in human experience. When hunter-gatherer bands clashed, and they certainly did sometimes, the fights were typically brief and limited in scope. Resources were scattered across the landscape, impossible for any one group to monopolize completely. There was always somewhere else to go, other territories to explore. Violence, when it occurred, was usually over quickly because neither side had resources worth dying for in large numbers. But farmers and herders had concentrated their wealth in specific, fixed locations. A successful raid could capture not just food for a few days, but entire herds that represented years, sometimes decades, of accumulated prosperity. A conquered field was a permanent asset that would continue producing value indefinitely. The spoils of agricultural warfare were worth fighting and dying for in ways that nomadic resources never had been. Even more importantly, these agricultural societies began organizing themselves around family lines in ways that would prove genetically devastating. As communities grew larger and more complex, extending beyond the small bands of 50 to 150 people that had characterized hunter-gatherer life, they started forming what anthropologists call patrilineal clans. These were extended family groups where identity, property, and power flowed exclusively from father to son through male bloodlines. Women might marry into the clan, but the core identity and inheritance belonged to the male lineage. This patrilineal organization created a genetic time bomb that would eventually detonate across the entire world. Within each clan, all the men were related through their fathers, which meant they carried nearly identical Y chromosomes. Brothers shared the same Y chromosome from their father. Their sons would share it. Their grandsons would share it. From a genetic perspective, it was as if each clan had only one father, no matter how many individual men it actually contained at any given time. The diversity that should have existed, with each man contributing his unique genetic signature to future generations, was compressed into single family lines. When these clans went to war with each other, they weren't just fighting over cattle, territory, or resources. They were fighting for genetic survival itself. This was competition at the most fundamental biological level, which set of genes would be passed to future generations and which would be eliminated entirely from the human gene pool. The mathematics of clan warfare were brutal and precise, following patterns that would compound over generations. When one patrilineal group defeated another in battle, the consequences went far beyond the immediate casualties on the battlefield. The losing clan's men would be killed outright or driven away from their lands, unable to support families or marry. This eliminated not just individual men but entire genetic lineages, whole branches of the human family tree cut off completely. The women and children of defeated clans, however, were often absorbed into the victorious group through marriage or servitude, where they would bear children carrying the conqueror's y-chromosomes. From a genetic perspective, this meant that victory in these conflicts didn't just preserve your own lineage, it actively spread your genetic signature by capturing the reproductive capacity of your enemies. Over generations, this pattern repeated across continents with mathematical inevitability. Each cycle of conflict further concentrated genetic diversity into fewer and fewer male lineages, while female diversity remained stable through absorption into victorious clans. Archaeological sites from this period tell the story of increasing violence and fortification with remarkable clarity. Villages that had existed for generations as open settlements suddenly surrounded themselves with wooden palisades, walls of sharpened logs driven into the ground. They dug deep ditches around their perimeters that would slow attackers and make them vulnerable to projectile weapons. They built watchtowers where sentries could spot approaching threats from miles away. Weapons became more sophisticated and explicitly deadly. Earlier, stone tools had served dual purposes. A blade might be used for butchering animals or defending against threats, but new weapons appeared that had only one purpose: killing other humans. Specialized daggers designed for thrusting into human bodies. Maces with stone heads shaped specifically to crush human skulls. Battle axes balanced for maximum damage in combat rather than for chopping wood. Mass graves filled with the victims of organized massacres appeared across Europe, Asia, and Africa. These weren't isolated incidents of violence, but evidence of systematic warfare between competing groups. Each burned settlement, each mass burial, each fortification represented not just a military event, but a potential genetic extinction event, entire family lines ending in a single afternoon of violence. The scale of this transformation becomes clear when you examine the archaeological record with genetic patterns in mind. Sites like Talheim in Germany, which we'll examine in detail shortly, reveal mass burials containing entire communities who were killed in single violent events. Men, women, and children lie buried together, their skulls crushed by stone axes, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of deliberate, systematic execution. These weren't random acts of violence. They were coordinated efforts to eliminate rival groups completely and permanently. Computer models created by modern population geneticists show exactly how this process could have produced the bottleneck we see in the genetic record today. When researchers simulate patrilineal clan warfare using mathematical models that incorporate what we know about ancient social structures, reproductive patterns, and conflict dynamics, the results match the DNA evidence with startling precision. The models work like this. You start with a simulated population, organized into patrilineal clans of various sizes. You program in the basic facts of agricultural life: herding, farming, property inheritance through male lines. You add realistic rates of conflict between clans competing for resources, Then you let the simulation run for hundreds of generations, watching how genetic diversity changes over time. Within just a few hundred years of simulated time, a tiny fraction of human evolutionary history, repeated cycles of conflict between related male groups can reduce genetic diversity by more than 90% while leaving female lineages largely intact. The math works out precisely because the patrilineal structure means that defeating one clan doesn't eliminate dozens of individual genetic lineages. It eliminates one lineage represented by many individuals. It's devastatingly efficient genetic reduction. The key insight that these simulations reveal is that this wasn't just warfare in the traditional sense. It was genetic replacement operating at a scale and speed unprecedented in human evolution. Each victory didn't simply mean control over territory or resources. It meant the expansion of one Y-chromosome lineage at the expense of countless others. The winners didn't just take the spoils of war. They took the future itself, ensuring that their genetic signatures would dominate the human gene pool for thousands of years to come. This process was amplified by emerging social hierarchies. As communities grew complex, they concentrated power and reproductive opportunities in the hands of elite males. Wealthy clan leaders could afford multiple wives, producing many sons who carried their Y-chromosomes forward. Meanwhile, men from less successful lineages found themselves unable to marry, their family lines ending in silence. The combination of warfare and social stratification created one of the most dramatic evolutionary events in human history. Culture itself became an agent of natural selection, determining which genetic lineages would survive and which would disappear forever. What makes this catastrophe haunting is how it unfolded simultaneously across the world. From the steppes of Central Asia to the river valleys of Europe, from the highlands of Africa to the coastal Mediterranean, the same pattern emerged everywhere humans had learned to farm and herd. The Y-chromosome collapsed while women's diversity flourished. The timing tells us everything. The bottleneck didn't begin immediately after agriculture was invented. It started roughly 5,000 years after farming had taken hold. Once societies had time to develop complex structures that made genetic elimination possible, humanity needed centuries to perfect the art of erasing itself. During these critical millennia, something fundamental shifted. Loose, egalitarian bands gave way to rigid hierarchies built around bloodlines. Chiefs emerged who could command hundreds of warriors. Priests developed rituals that sanctified violence in the name of ancestral honor. Trade networks spread weapons and warfare techniques across vast distances. Archaeological evidence reveals this emerging military culture. Bronze working spread rapidly, replacing stone tools with metal weapons that could kill more efficiently than anything humanity had created before. Copper daggers gave way to bronze swords. Simple spears evolved into specialized killing instruments. Horse domestication revolutionized mobility, allowing warrior bands to strike quickly across great distances. Herding societies developed particularly rigid patrilineal structures because livestock represented wealth that could be easily stolen. In such cultures, the male lineage became the foundation of identity, property rights, and social status. Boys were raised as future guardians of the family's genetic and economic legacy. This created warrior cultures where young men proved their worth through violence, where honor was measured by the ability to defend the clan's bloodline at any cost. The strategic goal of these campaigns wasn't temporary dominance, but permanent genetic replacement. Victorious clans didn't just want to defeat enemies. They wanted to occupy territories, absorb women, and ensure no male descendants survived to seek revenge in future generations. The economics of total warfare created powerful incentives for brutal tactics. Half measures left enemies alive to regroup and retaliate. Mercy was strategically foolish. Clans that showed restraint found themselves at disadvantages against those willing to pursue complete elimination. This process created what geneticists call founder effects on a massive scale. Entire continents came to be dominated by the Y chromosomes of just a handful of ancient patriarchs. The genetic pool became dominated by lineages that had proven most effective at eliminating competitors. The physical evidence for this warfare would soon be discovered in mass graves across Europe and Asia, providing archaeological confirmation of the brutal reality behind the genetic patterns. In 1983, construction workers near the German village of Thalheim uncovered what would become one of archaeology's most important discoveries. The Thalheim death pit contained 34 skeletons that tell a story of coordinated execution rather than battlefield casualties. Dr. Christian Meyer's forensic analysis reveals the cold efficiency of genetic elimination. The victims show specific patterns of cranial trauma consistent with deliberate execution, not combat deaths. Most skulls display single, fatal blows from heavy stone adzes or wooden clubs, delivered from behind or above while victims were kneeling or prone. These weren't defensive wounds from men fighting for their lives. These were execution wounds from helpless captives. The demographic composition perfectly matches the genetic warfare model. Of the 34 individuals, 20 were adult or adolescent males, 9 were children, and only 5 were adult women. This ratio is crucial. It strongly suggests that women of reproductive age, roughly 15 to 40 years old, were selectively spared from the massacre and taken elsewhere as captives. The 5 adult women found in the pit were likely older, perhaps grandmothers past childbearing age who held no reproductive value to the attackers. Meanwhile, males old enough to pose future threats, to seek revenge, to carry on the defeated clan's genetic lineage, they were all systematically eliminated. Isotope analysis of the Thalheim bones, which examines the chemical signatures left by diet and drinking water during childhood, confirms these weren't simply local villagers killed during a raid on their home settlement. The chemical signatures in their teeth indicate childhoods spent in different geological regions with different water sources and food types. These were captives who had been transported from distant locations, from multiple defeated communities, and brought together for coordinated elimination. This evidence points to something far more organized and terrifying than isolated local conflicts. This was evidence of systematic campaigns targeting multiple settlements, possibly coordinated raids that struck several farming communities in sequence. The attackers didn't just defeat their enemies in battle. They rounded up survivors, marched them to central locations, and processed them like livestock. Men and boys executed. Women of childbearing age captured for absorption into the victorious clan. Young children killed to prevent future revenge. Older women disposable. The forensic evidence reveals something else that makes this discovery particularly chilling. Sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy among the killers. The precise placement of fatal blows, the consistent targeting of specific points on the skull where bone is thinnest, the efficient single-strike kills. All of this indicates trained executioners, rather than frenzied, chaotic attackers overcome by bloodlust. These weren't crimes of passion or random acts of brutality carried out in the heat of battle. These were systematic procedures carried out by specialists who understood exactly how to kill efficiently and completely. Think about what that means. These ancient societies had developed professional killers, men who were trained from youth in the art of execution, who had performed these tasks multiple times before, who had refined their techniques through practice. The Schöneck-Kilianstetten mass grave, discovered in 2006, provides even more disturbing evidence. This site contained 26 individuals showing similar execution patterns, but with additional deliberate mutilation. Many adult male victims had their legs broken post-mortem, a practice that served no practical purpose, but may have had ritual significance in preventing spirits from seeking revenge. Rope marks on arm bones and the positioning of remains indicate many victims were restrained during execution. The organized nature of the killings, with bodies arranged in patterns within the grave pits, suggests elaborate protocols for processing large numbers of captives. The age profiles across multiple mass grave sites consistently show elimination of males who could pose genetic threats while preserving females who could contribute to the victor's reproductive success. Children were typically killed alongside adult males, preventing survival of any male offspring who might later seek revenge or compete for resources. The weapon signatures correspond exactly to the archaeological record of Bronze Age military innovation. The shift from projectile weapons designed for hunting to heavy-impact weapons designed for close combat execution reflects the nature of genetic warfare. These weren't defensive tools, but specialized killing instruments. The geographical distribution of mass execution sites across Central and Northern Europe indicates coordinated campaigns rather than isolated incidents. Similar patterns appear at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggesting shared tactical knowledge and strategic coordination. This wasn't random violence, but organized genocide targeting specific populations. The timing of these mass killings coincides precisely with the genetic bottleneck period. Radiocarbon dating places the executions between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, exactly when genetic analysis shows the dramatic reduction in male lineage diversity. The preservation of these sites was accidental, occurring only where geological conditions prevented normal decay. The nature of the killings suggests similar mass executions occurred across vast areas, but left no archaeological trace due to different burial conditions or deliberate concealment by perpetrators. The ritual elements reveal ideological frameworks that justify genetic elimination. Evidence of ceremonial treatment of some victims, combined with deliberate mutilation of others, indicates complex belief systems that sanctified eliminating rival bloodlines. These archaeological discoveries transform the Y-chromosome bottleneck from statistical abstraction into human reality. The genetic evidence showed male lineages collapsed. The mass graves show exactly how that collapse occurred through organized campaigns of execution designed to eliminate competing bloodlines while preserving reproductive resources for victors. Similar sites have been discovered across the ancient world. In France, the Aachen massacre site shows evidence of an entire settlement burned with inhabitants killed and buried beneath rubble. In Central Europe, fortified villages surrounded by defensive walls and filled with weapon-scarred skeletons tell the same story of conflict between organized groups. Each site represents not just tragedy, but a genetic extinction event that removed irreplaceable diversity from the human gene pool. The weapons found reveal the technological arms race that fueled this destruction. Stone axes gave way to copper blades, which evolved into bronze swords designed specifically for killing humans. Arrowheads became more sophisticated, crafted for maximum damage. Defensive armor appeared for the first time, suggesting warfare had become common enough to justify the enormous effort required to create protective gear. But perhaps most telling are the fortifications themselves. Villages that had existed for centuries as open settlements suddenly surrounded themselves with wooden palisades, deep ditches, and watchtowers. These weren't built to keep out wild animals. They were designed to defend against other humans who had become as dangerous as any force of nature. The timing of these archaeological changes matches the genetic evidence perfectly. As Y-chromosome diversity collapsed, signs of violence and fortification proliferated. It wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect playing out on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had experienced before. Trade networks that had once spread beneficial technologies now carried weapons and warfare innovations at the speed of ancient commerce. A new type of bronze sword developed in one region could appear hundreds of miles away within a generation, carried by traders who moved between communities that might soon be at war. The mathematical precision of this genetic elimination becomes clear when researchers model how patrilineal clan warfare could have produced the observed patterns. Computer simulations incorporating archaeological evidence of widespread violence generate results matching DNA data almost exactly. The models show that repeated conflicts between related male groups, combined with absorption of defeated populations, could reduce Y-chromosome diversity by 90% in just 500 years. These simulations predict regional variations in the bottleneck's severity that match both archaeological evidence and anthropological understanding. Areas where pastoral societies dominated show more dramatic genetic collapses than regions focused on settled agriculture, reflecting increased violence in herding cultures and how mobile societies organize around patrilineal kinship groups. The archaeological evidence provides undeniable confirmation of the warfare that created the Y-chromosome bottleneck. But who were the ultimate winners of this genetic war? Before we find out, leave a like so we know you're following along. Your support means the word to us. The Yamnaya expansion represents the ultimate expression and culmination of the systematic warfare that created the Y-chromosome bottleneck. These steppe nomads didn't simply migrate into new territories the way peaceful populations might drift across landscapes over centuries. They implemented refined and perfected versions of the genetic replacement strategies that had proven devastatingly effective during the bottleneck period. Their success transformed not just the genetic landscape of Eurasia, but established the cultural, linguistic, and technological foundations that would define modern civilization across 2 continents. Their culture emerged from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan, around 3,500 BCE. They arose at precisely the right moment in history, when several independent technological innovations came together to create an unstoppable military and demographic force. Their timing was, in a sense, perfect for conquest. Their mastery of horse domestication provided unprecedented mobility for raiding and conquest operations. While other agricultural societies were tied to their fields and limited to the speed of human walking, Yamnaya warriors could travel 50 miles in a single day on horseback. They could strike far from home, raid enemy settlements with devastating speed, and retreat before effective resistance could be organized. The horse transformed warfare from a local defensive activity into an offensive weapon that could project power across enormous distances. Their development of wheeled vehicles, among the earliest known to humanity, allowed rapid transportation of warriors, weapons, food supplies, and captured resources across vast distances. These weren't primitive carts, but sophisticated 4-wheeled wagons capable of carrying heavy loads across rough terrain. With these wagons, Yamnaya groups could launch extended campaigns far from their home territories, maintaining their mobility while bringing along everything they needed to sustain military operations for weeks or months. Their metallurgical expertise produced superior bronze weapons and tools that gave decisive advantages in combat against populations still primarily using stone implements. Bronze axes could cleave through wooden shields. Bronze daggers could pierce leather armor. Bronze-tipped arrows could strike with greater force and penetration than stone. The technological gap between bronze-equipped Yamnaya warriors and Stone Age defenders was roughly equivalent to the gap between musket-armed colonial armies and indigenous forces armed with clubs and spears. The archaeological evidence reveals the nature of their conquest campaigns. Their distinctive Kurgan burial mounds appear across thousands of kilometers within just a few centuries, marking not gradual migration but rapid territorial occupation. These burial sites consistently show evidence of male-dominated hierarchies, with elaborate grave goods indicating concentration of wealth and power in successful warriors' hands. The genetic evidence confirms the unprecedented success of Yamnaya expansion strategies. Within 500 years, Yamnaya-derived Y-chromosome lineages had replaced up to 90% of existing male lineages across vast areas of Europe and Central Asia. This replacement rate exceeds anything seen in the archaeological record before or since, indicating elimination rather than gradual population mixing. The demographic patterns reveal sophisticated understanding of reproductive strategies. Genetic analysis shows Yamnaya males married into local populations rather than bringing large numbers of Yamnaya women. This pattern maximizes the spread of Yamnaya Y chromosomes while minimizing resources needed for conquest campaigns. The technological package that enabled Yamnaya success represented the culmination of innovations developed during the bottleneck period. Horse domestication had been perfected through centuries of pastoral competition on the steppes. Wheeled vehicles emerged from the need to transport wealth and weapons during extended raiding campaigns. Bronze working reached new sophistication levels in specialized military equipment production. The social organization reflected hierarchical principles established during the genetic wars. Archaeological evidence shows extreme wealth differentiation, with elite males buried with dozens of sacrificed horses, elaborate metal weapons, and evidence of polygynous marriage arrangements. These weren't simply status symbols but practical tools for genetic dominance. The speed of Yamnaya territorial expansion required logistical capabilities that could only have developed through extensive warfare experience. Coordinating simultaneous campaigns across multiple fronts, establishing supply lines across thousands of kilometers, and integrating conquered territories into coherent administrative systems all indicate sophisticated military organization. The linguistic evidence confirms the nature of Yamnaya cultural replacement. Proto-Indo-European languages spread with Yamnaya genetic lineages, replacing existing language families across vast territories. This linguistic replacement was as thorough as the genetic one, suggesting coordinated efforts to eliminate not just competing bloodlines, but competing cultural identities. The religious innovations associated with Yamnaya expansion reflect ideological frameworks that justified genetic warfare. The Indo-European pantheon emphasized warrior gods, divine sanction for conquest, and mythologies celebrating the replacement of chaos with order through heroic violence. These weren't simply cultural preferences, but strategic tools for legitimizing genetic replacement. The economic systems established by Yamnaya expansion institutionalized principles of genetic competition that had driven the bottleneck. Pastoral nomadism created portable wealth that could be accumulated, defended, and used to support polygynous reproduction. Raiding became organized economic activity rather than opportunistic violence. The integration of conquered populations followed consistent patterns that maximized genetic replacement while preserving useful skills and knowledge. Local males were eliminated or marginalized, while females were incorporated into Yamnaya kinship systems. Children born from these unions carried Yamnaya y-chromosomes while preserving local cultural knowledge that enhanced Yamnaya capabilities. The timing of Yamnaya expansion coincided with climatic changes that created opportunities for conquest. Cooling temperatures and changing precipitation patterns disrupted established agricultural communities while favoring mobile pastoral societies. The Yamnaya exploited these environmental shifts to implement genetic replacement on unprecedented scale. The archaeological record of Yamnaya settlement patterns reveals strategic thinking designed for long-term genetic dominance. They consistently occupied high-status locations, controlled key resources like metal deposits and trade routes, and established defensive positions that could be maintained with minimal manpower. These weren't temporary occupations, but permanent genetic implantations. The metallurgical innovations associated with Yamnaya expansion provided decisive military advantages over populations still using stone tools. Bronze weapons and tools represented not just technological improvements, but force multipliers that allowed small Yamnaya war parties to defeat much larger local populations. The evidence for Yamnaya success extends far beyond Europe and Central Asia. Genetic analysis reveals Yamnaya-derived lineages spreading into South Asia, the Middle East, and reaching the edges of East Asia. This global expansion represents the most successful genetic replacement campaign in human history. The cultural legacy of Yamnaya expansion shaped the development of Bronze Age civilizations across Eurasia. The hierarchical social structures, warrior ideologies, and inheritance systems that characterized early Indo-European societies all derive from organizational principles that enabled Yamnaya genetic dominance. 4 major surviving lineages emerged from this conquest to become dominant sources of male ancestry across vast regions, and their distribution tells the story of ancient conquests with precision that would be impossible to achieve through archaeological evidence alone. Haplogroup R1b, which originated in the western Pontic-Caspian steppe, swept across Europe from east to west like a genetic tsunami. It reached the Atlantic coast of Ireland and Portugal by 2500 BCE, completely replacing or overwhelming local male lineages along the way. Today, over 80% of men in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Western France carry this single genetic marker. In Spain and Portugal, the frequency exceeds 70%. Even in regions as far removed as northern Italy, R1b lineages account for more than half of all Y-chromosomes. This isn't gradual genetic mixing, it's wholesale replacement that could only result from systematic processes. Simultaneously, haplogroup R1a spread eastward and southward from the steppes, establishing dominance across Central Asia, reaching through the Caucasus into Iran, and penetrating deep into the Indian subcontinent. In northern India and Pakistan, R1a lineages account for substantial portions of male ancestry, carried by populations who also brought Indo-European languages and cultural traditions that would reshape South Asian civilization. The other two major surviving lineages showed similar patterns of explosive expansion and demographic replacement, each creating genetic landscapes that persist to the present day across territories spanning millions of square kilometers. The mathematical impossibility of such replacement rates without systematic elimination confirms the nature of what occurred. Computer simulations show that achieving 90% replacement in 500 years through peaceful intermarriage or even moderate conflict would be impossible. The numbers only work if you include systematic elimination of local males, combined with widespread absorption of local females through marriage or capture. Indo-European languages followed these genetic patterns with suspicious precision. From Ireland to India, from Scandinavia to Iran, languages derived from a common Proto-Indo-European ancestor replaced existing language families along exactly the same routes and at exactly the same speed as Yamnaya genetic signatures. The correlation between genetic and linguistic replacement indicates that cultural elimination accompanied genetic warfare. Competing identities were erased along with competing bloodlines. Most men alive today, across Europe, much of Asia, and through their descendants in the Americas and elsewhere, descend from approximately 4 ancestral lineages that survived and expanded during this period. The Yamnaya expansion consolidated advantages gained during centuries of clan competition and extended them across continents. The modern distribution of human genetic diversity still bears the fingerprints of their unprecedented campaign of replacement. While male bloodlines were being systematically erased, women's genetic story tells something entirely different, a narrative of survival, adaptation, and continuity that reveals the complete picture of humanity's most dramatic genetic transformation. The mitochondrial DNA record shows that women not only survived the bottleneck period, but played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge across the genetic divide. While male Y-chromosome diversity collapsed by 90%, mitochondrial DNA maintained remarkable stability and even expanded in many regions, creating the most extreme example of sex-biased population dynamics in human evolutionary history. The genetic evidence reveals that women moved freely between competing groups throughout the bottleneck period, carrying diverse mitochondrial lineages across territorial boundaries that were impermeable to men. This mobility wasn't simply the result of capture or forced marriage, but represented strategic alliances that helped maintain genetic diversity while male lineages were being eliminated. Archaeological sites show women buried with artifacts from multiple cultural traditions, indicating their status as bridges between different populations. Their grave goods often include items associated with healing, textile production, and food preparation, suggesting specialized knowledge that made them valuable to multiple competing groups. The demographic mathematics of female survival reveals sophisticated strategies for population maintenance. While male effective population sizes crashed, female effective population sizes remained stable or even increased, indicating deliberate efforts to preserve reproductive capacity even while eliminating competing bloodlines. This pattern could only result from systematic policies designed to maximize genetic diversity on the female side while minimizing it on the male side. The linguistic evidence supports women's roles as carriers of cultural continuity during genetic replacement. Many Indo-European languages contain substrate elements from pre-Indo-European populations, suggesting local cultural knowledge was preserved and transmitted through female lineages, even after complete male lineage replacement. Women served as living libraries, preserving the accumulated wisdom of eliminated populations. The technological transmission patterns during the bottleneck period confirm women's roles as preservers of essential knowledge. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in textile production, food processing, and ceramic traditions, even in regions with complete Y-chromosome replacement. These technologies required specialized knowledge that could only be maintained through experienced practitioners who survived the genetic transition. The religious and ritual evidence reveals women's central roles in maintaining spiritual traditions that bridged old and new populations. Many Bronze Age religious practices show continuity with earlier Neolithic traditions, despite complete replacement of male religious authorities. Women served as priestesses, healers, and ritual specialists who preserved sacred knowledge across the genetic divide. The marriage patterns revealed by genetic analysis show that women's reproductive choices helped shape the bottleneck's outcome. The mixing of local mitochondrial lineages with incoming Y-chromosomes suggests women played active roles in negotiating alliances and determining which male lineages would ultimately succeed. The genetic diversity patterns preserved in mitochondrial DNA reveal the geographic scope of women's networks during the bottleneck. While Y-chromosome lineages show sharp geographical boundaries corresponding to territorial conquest, mitochondrial lineages show gradual transitions and extensive mixing across vast distances, indicating continuous movement and interaction between female populations. Sites consistently show evidence of female-controlled spaces for textile production, food preparation, and child-rearing, suggesting women's specialized knowledge made them indispensable even to competing male lineages. The genetic evidence reveals women served as the primary mechanism for population recovery following the bottleneck period. The rapid expansion of human populations after 3000 BCE was facilitated by the preservation of female reproductive capacity and genetic diversity, allowing successful male lineages to quickly repopulate territories they had conquered. The cultural transmission patterns documented in Bronze Age archaeological sites confirm women's roles as preservers of technological innovation. Many advances in metallurgy, agriculture, and craft production during this period show continuity with earlier traditions, suggesting women preserved and transmitted essential technical knowledge across the genetic divide. The demographic recovery patterns following the bottleneck confirm that female genetic diversity provided the foundation for renewed population growth. The rapid expansion of human populations across Eurasia after 3000 BCE was facilitated by the broad base of mitochondrial lineages that had been preserved during the period of male genetic collapse. The female lineages represent humanity's insurance policy against genetic catastrophe. Their preservation of diversity, cultural knowledge, and reproductive capacity during the most extreme bottleneck in human history demonstrates the resilience and strategic importance of women in human evolutionary success. While men fought wars of genetic elimination, women maintained the bridges that prevented complete cultural collapse and enabled eventual recovery. The legacy of this genetic warfare extends far beyond ancient battlefields. The organizational principles, social hierarchies, and cultural patterns that emerged from the bottleneck period became the foundational template for every major civilization that followed. The victorious lineages didn't just win a war, they established the blueprint for human society that would persist for millennia. The transition from clan-based warfare to state formation happened with remarkable speed across Eurasia. Within centuries of the bottleneck's end, scattered tribal territories controlled by successful patrilineal groups had consolidated into the first true kingdoms. These weren't gradual developments of political complexity, but rapid implementations of systems specifically designed to preserve and expand advantages won through elimination of competitors. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age sites reveals immediate institutionalization of hierarchical control. Palace complexes emerged with clear distinctions between elite residential areas and common quarters. Elaborate burial sites show unprecedented wealth concentration, with ruling families interred alongside hundreds of precious objects, while common graves contain minimal possessions. These disparities weren't personal preferences, but structural features of societies organized around genetic privilege. The administrative systems that managed these early kingdoms bore the fingerprints of their wartime origins. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley focus heavily on genealogies, inheritance laws, and military organization. Writing itself became a tool for maintaining genetic hierarchies established through conquest, ensuring advantages of successful bloodlines could be preserved across generations even as individual leaders died. The religious frameworks that legitimized these new kingdoms reflected ideological systems that had justified the original genetic wars. Divine kingship emerged simultaneously across multiple regions, with rulers claiming direct descent from warrior gods who had conquered chaotic forces through organized violence. These weren't independent cultural developments, but variations on themes established during the period of bloodline elimination. The concept of sacred kingship served multiple functions beyond simple political control. By linking genetic heritage to divine mandate, successful lineages could transform battlefield victories into permanent religious authority. The same Y-chromosome signatures that marked genetic dominance became proof of divine selection, creating self-reinforcing systems where genetic and spiritual power reinforced each other. Trade networks that developed during the post-bottleneck period reflected resource control systems perfected during the genetic wars. Successful lineages had learned to coordinate economic activity across vast territories during conquest campaigns. The administrative capabilities developed for managing captured wealth, redistributing resources among allied clans, and maintaining supply lines during extended warfare translated directly into commercial advantages. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across Bronze Age civilizations indicates sophisticated understanding of economic coordination developed through military necessity. The same organizational principles that had enabled Brotherhood armies to coordinate simultaneous attacks across multiple fronts became the foundation for trade systems that connected regions separated by thousands of kilometers. Military technology continued evolving along trajectories established during the bottleneck period. The Bronze Age arms race that had driven the genetic collapse intensified into weapons development programs. Professional warrior classes emerged as hereditary castes, passing down not just fighting techniques, but cultural frameworks that justified organized violence in service of genetic dominance. The fortress cities that appeared across Eurasia during this period reflected defensive strategies perfected during conquest campaigns. Urban planning incorporated lessons learned from centuries of siege warfare, with defensive walls, strategic water supplies, and coordinated military architecture that could withstand assault techniques developed during the genetic wars. Legal systems that emerged from Bronze Age civilizations codified inheritance principles that had driven the original bottleneck. Property laws, marriage regulations, and succession rules all reflected the need to maintain genetic advantages across generations. These weren't abstract legal concepts, but practical tools for preserving demographic dominance achieved through elimination of competitors. The development of written law codes like Hammurabi's represents institutionalization of genetic competition through legal rather than military means. The same strategic thinking that had driven clan warfare was channeled into administrative systems designed to maintain reproductive monopolies through economic and legal mechanisms rather than direct violence. Marriage customs that developed during this period formalized reproductive strategies that had proven successful during the genetic wars. Bride wealth systems, arranged marriages between elite families, and strict controls on female reproductive choices all served to concentrate genetic advantages while excluding unsuccessful lineages from reproductive opportunities. The emergence of professional priesthoods during the Bronze Age reflected the need to manage ideological systems that justified genetic hierarchy. Religious specialists developed elaborate mythologies, ritual practices, and theological frameworks that transformed battlefield victories into cosmic order, ensuring genetic dominance appeared natural and divinely ordained rather than historically contingent. Educational systems that emerged in early civilizations were designed to preserve and transmit cultural advantages of successful lineages. Elite schools, specialized training programs, and hereditary knowledge transmission all served to maintain intellectual and technical superiority that had contributed to genetic success during the bottleneck period. The architectural monuments that defined Bronze Age civilizations served multiple functions in maintaining genetic hierarchy. Pyramids, ziggurats, and megalithic structures weren't just religious or ceremonial buildings, but demonstrations of organizational capabilities that had enabled conquest. They provided permanent reminders of the genetic elite's capacity for coordinated action on unprecedented scales. Agricultural innovations that supported Bronze Age population growth reflected resource management systems developed during the conquest period. Irrigation networks, crop rotation techniques, and livestock breeding programs all represented applications of organizational principles perfected during campaigns that created the genetic bottleneck. The patterns established during the bottleneck period created templates that would be copied and refined by every subsequent empire. The Roman legions, Greek phalanxes, and medieval feudal systems all represented variations on organizational principles first developed during genetic warfare of the Neolithic period. The basic logic of coordinated violence in service of genetic dominance remained consistent across millennia. Social stratification systems that emerged from Bronze Age civilizations institutionalized genetic hierarchies established during the bottleneck. Caste systems, hereditary nobility, and rigid class structures all served to maintain reproductive advantages won through elimination of competitors. These weren't simply political arrangements, but genetic preservation mechanisms. The military organizations that characterized Bronze Age states represented institutionalization of brotherhood army principles. Professional warrior classes, hereditary military leadership, and specialized combat training all reflected organizational innovations that had enabled genetic warfare. The same coordination capabilities were preserved and refined for defending rather than expanding genetic dominance. Economic systems that developed during this period reflected resource concentration strategies that had driven the original genetic collapse. Tribute collection, redistributive networks, and centralized wealth management all represented applications of principles developed during conquest campaigns. Economic power became another mechanism for maintaining genetic advantages across generations. The inheritance systems that characterized Bronze Age civilizations ensured that genetic advantages won through warfare would persist across generations. Property laws, succession rules, and marriage customs all served to concentrate resources in hands of successful lineages while preventing redistribution that might have allowed unsuccessful bloodlines to recover reproductive access. Yet even as societies learned to organize more peacefully, the genetic legacy of the bottleneck remained embedded in human populations. Modern populations still bear the molecular signatures of ancient conquests, carrying genetic memories of a time when humanity nearly destroyed itself through its own social evolution. The uncomfortable truth: civilization's organizational principles emerged from warfare. The same capabilities that enabled Bronze Age kingdoms to build monuments, coordinate trade, and develop writing were refined through centuries of genetic competition. The hierarchies we inherited, the inheritance systems we take for granted, the very concept of bloodline, all carry echoes of this ancient catastrophe. Understanding the collapse reframes human history. Hierarchy didn't emerge from natural inequality. It emerged from specific technological and social changes that made inherited wealth possible. Once property could be inherited, violence became the tool for securing genetic immortality. The rapid rise of civilization after these events wasn't mysterious. It represented formalization of organizational principles proven during violent centuries. Warband logistics became trade networks. Clan hierarchy became social stratification. Genealogical tracking became writing systems. Divine kingship legitimized accumulated military success. The collapse explains why concepts like bloodline, dynasty, and lineage carry cultural weight despite genetic literacy. For 2,000 years, bloodline literally determined survival. That period's shadow extends into present social organization. But this history doesn't condemn us to repeat it. The bottleneck teaches us that human nature is not fixed, but shaped by the systems we create. The same species capable of systematic elimination also proved capable of building cooperation, of valuing diversity, of choosing civilization over chaos. The Ghost War that erased 90% of male lineages left no written records, built no monuments, and was forgotten by history. But it shaped everything that came after. Every kingdom, every empire, every civilization built on principles refined during those brutal millennia. Every man alive today carries in his cells the molecular memory of ancestors who survived this collapse. Not because they were better, but because they were on the winning side of history's most dramatic population transformation. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the bloodlines that ended in silence. And remember, every time you look in the mirror, you're seeing the face of someone whose ancestors survived humanity's greatest genetic filter. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries that shape human history. Until next time, sweet dreams, and keep questioning.